All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about the state of democracy in the US. We are very happy and honored to have today's speakers with us. I would like to warmly welcome Daniel Siblat, Eaton Professor of Government at Harvard University and Director of the Transformations of Democracy Unit at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. He's also the author of How Democracies Die, together with Steve Levitsky, excuse me. Also, a warm welcome to Åsa Wikfors, who is a professor of theoretical philosophy at Stockholm University and a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and of the Swedish Academy. She's the author of the forthcoming book, Därför demokrati, which will be available in bookstores in May, and Jan Hallenberg, research leader at UI, professor emeritus in political science at the Swedish National Defense University, and an expert on US foreign and security policy. My name is Ylva Pettersson, and I work as program manager here at the Institute. I would like to encourage all of our viewers to send me your questions through the Q&A function here on Zoom or as comments on our live stream on Facebook. I will bring up as many as possible during this hour, but please help me do so by making them short and precise. This is a huge topic. I expect a lot of questions from you, the audience, and we have only got an hour, so let's make the most of it and jump straight into the issue. And I'm going to turn to Daniel and ask you, what impact has former President Donald Trump had on American democracy? Please.
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me. It's really great to be here with all of you. Yeah, so what impact has Donald Trump had? In net terms, I would say a very negative impact. I mean, there's clearly, I mean, it was very clear from before he ran for office through the time he was in office, he was a threat to American democracy. I mean, he was somebody who at best was indifferent to democratic institutions and rules. He was certainly a symptom of other problems. I mean, his rise to success reflected underlying levels of polarization and dysfunction in American society, but he himself, I think, did not help the cause of American democracy and represented a real threat. And his assault on the rule of law institutions, he contributed to polarization, a kind of normalization of racism. Just in the last 48 hours in the United States, we've had an attack on Asian American women in Atlanta. And, you know, one doesn't want to blame single-handedly on one person for this kind of action, for not a politician, but certainly the rhetoric that's infused American life during his presidency and since was you know, heightening of racial tensions. So in all of these ways, he was a real threat. I mean, I think one of the kind of positive effects of all of this is that Americans have grown much more attuned to the idea that a democracy is not something that runs on its own, that requires an engaged citizenry, that we shouldn't take it for granted. And so in that sense, the reaction to the Trump presidency, I think, has been quite positive. But, you know, I would prefer to have lived in a democracy where we didn't have this experience to come to this realization. So overall, I think he's been a serious threat, and we're certainly not out of the woods, because I think, you know, his exit from the presidency doesn't mean that Trumpism as a phenomena has disappeared. And I think the Republican Party itself, in many ways, reflects a lot of the kind of approaches that he adopted to politics. And it's very likely the Republicans come back into office in 2022, 2024, and in many ways, I think we'll be right back where we were in the last several years.
Åsa, would you do the same analysis?
Yes, I mean, of course, I completely agree with all the things that were said here and the assessment that has been overall very, very negative for American democracy. And one thing, of course, that interests me is precisely, I'm interested in the role of truth and knowledge in democracy. And what Trump has shown very clearly, first of all, is that you can completely break the norms when it comes to how a politician behaves with regard to knowledge and truth. You can lie. You know you're lying, people know you're lying, and it's still fine. You can spread disinformation to suit your own purposes and in a very, very efficient way. And you can exploit the new information technology for these purposes. And it's almost unlimited what you can do, it seems. You can even get a great majority of the Republican voters to believe that the election was stolen in the face of all the evidence showing that there was nothing wrong with the election. So it sort of opens a door to something I think we didn't really know was possible in a democracy before. I mean, this is how authoritarian leaders behave, right? They will just throw out propaganda at the people and fool people and so on. But you thought that in a democracy where you have a well-functioning sort of educational system, somewhat well-functioning, where you have a media system that works fairly well, that can fact check, and that can sort of counteract all the falsehoods, you thought that it would sort of correct itself, that democracy would be able to deal with this kind of threat. But I think he has shown that that's not necessarily the case. I think he has shown that you can cause tremendous damage by just flooding all these rules relating to truth, and achieve your goals that way. And I think it also shows that, I mean, people often say that democracy is resilient. Democracy is the kind of type of governing that can solve any problem that comes its way. But it may be that this problem it can't solve, because the tools whereby democracy solves its problems is precisely that truth comes out, media works, we find out how it is, we vote, we replace the politicians that don't do what they said they would do, and so on. When that falls apart, it's not clear democracy can handle the problem.
Jan, what is your take on?
I agree with everything that has been said before. I just want to add another worrying fact. It is the legitimation of political violence. I mean, the fact that the Republican Party don't seem to be able to condemn what happened on January 6th. And that so many Republicans in Congress didn't want to vote to ratify the results of the presidential election. And this is grows from what was just said, but I think just the use of political violence also is very frightening, to know that there are so many people that are ready to take up arms. And I mean, there are polls that say that 30 to 50% of Republicans are prepared to take up arms to prevent political developments they do not like. That, I think, is very threatening.
This is something that we will come back to a little bit later, but maybe I will ask this to you, Daniel. How important is it, the results of what President Trump has done, and or seeing him as part of a larger trend, or a symbol of a bigger scale development?
Yeah, so I mean, I think both certainly matter, and it's important to kind of emphasize. I mean, when we wrote our book, How Democracies Die, in 2017, 2018, I mean, it was really motivated by the election of Donald Trump, and we saw all of the ways in which I think that what my colleagues have just mentioned here, the attack on media institutions, the attack on voting institutions, and the condoning of violence. I mean, these are the three things that are absolutely have been a terrible, terrible development. Because, if you don't have a majority of Republicans now essentially don't believe the media because Donald Trump tells them not to. A majority of Republicans don't accept election results because Donald Trump has told them not to. And a majority of Republicans, or large segments of Republicans, condone violence. You can't have a democracy when these three pillars, the absence of violence, free media, and elections, aren't working, right? So this has clearly been a major problem. But that said, I mean, the thing that I think I was most surprised by, I would say, I mean, when we wrote our book, I think in many ways we were overly optimistic. I mean, we wrote our book in part to a Republican audience. That was one of our intended audience, to kind of highlight the dangers. And I expected, perhaps naively, that Republican members of Congress, that's Republican politicians, would draw a line, and unacceptable behavior they would call out. And so that did not happen for the most part. Even the January 6th events. I mean, there was a kind of moment, 24-hour, 48-hour period where Republican allies of President Trump had said, well, this is unacceptable, but then very quickly they were going down to Mar-a-Lago to meet with him after that. So Republicans have not done this. And so I think, in terms of is it all Donald Trump's fault, or is there something else? I think there's a broader problem. The kind of other key actor here is the Republican Party, and the willingness of the Republican Party to tolerate this behavior. And, this is an old story, though. I mean, this, as somebody who studies European political history and history in other countries, I mean, there's a way in which I think many Republican leaders kind of feel sorry for themselves, that they're in this tough bind, that they have this popular person that they don't particularly like or think he's a danger, but don't want to criticize him and they think they're in a tough bind. And, the reality, of course, this is a very old bind. Other politicians throughout history have faced this kind of challenge. And whether one's talking about the 1920s in Italy or the early 1930s in Germany, where you have establishment politicians who see a demagogue and don't quite know how to deal with him and think, well, I could, and they kind of tell themselves the story that if I step back, this actually gives a freer hand to this person. And so I have this responsibility to participate. But in fact, this is a kind of self-justifying story that's often gets told. And I think, so again, I think what this indicates is that that there is a broader problem. And it's not, if Donald Trump were to retire from politics and give up all ambitions, we still face this threat of a Republican Party that's becoming increasingly, there was a great political scientist, Juan Linz, who in the 1970s had invented this category of the anti-system party as well as the semi-loyal party. That is a political party that is not entirely loyal to the constitutional order. And I think there's elements in the Republican Party that look like a semi-loyal party. And so that's the deeper problem. We could get into the kind of deeper sociological underpinnings, at the level of kind of polarization in society that I think also in part have brought this about. But most immediately, I think the biggest risk, in addition to President Trump, former President Trump, is the Republican Party itself.
I think that you're coming down to, I mean, for me, one of the key questions, and what Åsa also already talked about, how do you deal with this within the democratic institutions? Because of the, as you also mentioned, problems of the democratic system to handle these kind of issues. I guess that will be a question for later on when we are looking forward to forward-looking answers. But what about then the election of President Biden? What does that say about the democracy? Does it work? Daniel, would you like to go first on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I think the election in November and the transition of power, as embarrassing and problematic as it was, does indicate something, which is that our electoral institutions, despite being very flawed, work. And this is no small achievement. In general, incumbents win re-election. And if you have an incumbent who has authoritarian tendencies, it's even harder to get them out of office. I mean, one can think of developments in Turkey, one can think of developments in Hungary. And I think there were a lot of people who were worried that the U.S. was going down that path. But what I think is what makes the U.S. different from these other cases where you've had authoritarians elected to power and who've then stayed in power is that we have number one, we have a very strong opposition. There has been a very strong opposition. I mean, the Democratic Party is a much more effective opposition, was a much more effective opposition than let's say the opposition to Viktor Orban in Hungary or the opposition to Erdogan in Turkey. Better organized, more well-financed, more, developed an effective electoral appeal, in the end had a better candidate. And so this worked. And then that's number one, we had a strong opposition. Number two, the election actually worked. I mean, despite all of the flaws, the efforts to intervene and to disrupt the election was by and large, free and fair, and there was massive voter turnout. And so this is a great achievement. So I think Americans should rightly be proud of the fact that we, dodged that bullet. I mean, that said, it's, I'm setting a very low bar here for levels of pride because this is essentially just the normal functioning of a democracy. But it was not automatic that this would be the case. Now that all of that said, now that Biden's in office and he's, from my perspective, been much more effective immediately in dealing with COVID and dealing with the economic crisis than his predecessor. We still have lots of flaws in the American political system, and I'm one who thinks that there's major areas of need in the reform of our democratic institutions, and it's not just to give you. I mean, I'll give you one example and then hand it off to my colleagues here. So we have this very obscure procedure in the U.S. Senate of the filibuster, where essentially it's a rule in the Senate. It's not a part of the Constitution. It's a Senate rule that could be abolished by the U.S. Senate at any point. That in order for legislation to get through the Senate, for most legislation, you need not only to have 50 votes, but you essentially need to have 60 votes. And what this means, though, is that all kind of meaningful legislation gets stalled out, and it's hard to. And so this is a kind of obscure rule in the Senate, but I think this has global ramifications because our ability to deal with, to form alliances with other countries, to deal with climate change, as well as to deal with COVID, require that legislation go through the Senate. And so this is a kind of thing that's a small institutional problem, but if this is the kind of reform that's absolutely necessary to make our democracy work. And at the end of the day, citizens want their democracies to deliver things for them. And if we can't deliver basic public policy, then there'll be growing distrust in our institutions.
I think that we will be coming back to the Congress and also to this bill in a short while. But Jan, do you have any other comments on the importance of the election of President Biden?
It was very important, and he had got 7 million votes more than Donald Trump. But if 50 or 60,000 votes in 3 or 4 states had gone the other way, Donald Trump would now be president. So in addition to the problems that Daniel mentioned, I mean, there's also the question of the Electoral College, which gives all the electoral votes from each state to one leader. And that is skewed in a way so that it's easier for Republicans, one could argue, to get a majority. So that's another added problem to what Daniel said.
All right. Åsa, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly the Electoral College setup in the US causes all sorts of trouble. And of course, it was a close call, right? Because if it hadn't been for certain officials in these states who stuck to their guns or followed the rules, who knows what would have happened. And the other thing about the Electoral College is that you get this sort of small margins in a couple of states that can change the outcome in a radical way. Which happened both in 2016 and this time it went the other way, it makes it also vulnerable to disinformation. So there's some research suggesting that in the states that Trump won in 2016 with a very small margin, 10, 20,000 votes, fake news played a very important role in determining that outcome. So there's when you have the national vote and you just look at the total, then I think disinformation would probably not be able to turn an election over. But when you have this system, it can happen, and that's very, very scary.
All right, so then let's turn to Congress. I wanted to ask you about the implications of having a Congress that has difficulties reaching any kind of decision. And also, viewers' question, the Democrats' legislative proposal about voting rights seems an absolute necessity if democracy is to survive. Does the panel agree? So I will give you both of those questions. Maybe Daniel, want to go first?
Yeah, on the second point, the voting rights reform is, yeah, I agree with this. I mean, I think one of the so first of all, one of the kind of unusual features of our system is that it's a highly decentralized electoral system, meaning it's up to each state essentially to run elections, including for national elections. This is a great weakness of our system, and it goes back to the fact that we have this 18th century constitution. In fact, one of the weaknesses of the Electoral College, which has really only been discovered, I think, by a lot of people in the last year, is that Article 2 of the Constitution, which lays out how the president gets elected, says it's up to the states to decide how the electors get selected. And so, people have always assumed this means you have elections, whoever gets the most votes. But there's now a kind of growing legal argument in conservative circles that say, well, it's up to the state. So if the state decides it's not really clear. It's not clear that you actually have to have the majority of the vote. Maybe it's up to the state legislature to decide. And so, this is this weakness of our system. And so because we have this highly decentralized system, and going back to the Jim Crow era as well, there's always been massive abuses of voting rights at the state level. And so, efforts to nationalize our elections have always been halted because of the power of the states. And very sensible sounding things like voter IDs, which every country in the world has, any established democracy has, are actually used as a vehicle of voter suppression in the United States. And so in this kind of strange perversion, Democrats who view themselves as defenders of voting rights say introducing a voting ID is actually a mechanism of exclusion. And Republicans very instrumentally say we want to have voter IDs, but they're doing this really very strategically, in a context in which national IDs aren't created or don't exist. And so they can use this as a method of exclusion for those who don't have a driver's license or who don't vote. So anything that gets more people to vote is more democratic. So that's one point. And so these reforms are really critical. And there's vast efforts underway at the state level right now to kind of restrict voting rights. So a national legislation to combat that is important. But I think there's a second, less appreciated way in which voting rights matters. And, I think the Republican Party, by all measures, has become a much more extreme party. And I think part of the reason it's become a more extreme party is that, unlike most parties, when you lose an election, that's when you reform. So you've gone too far away from the voters. The Republican Party is in some ways insulated from this, the kind of market mechanism of a normal electoral competition, because they have set up a way in which they don't actually have to win majority of the vote to gain office. You know, no president has won, no Republican president has won a majority of the vote since the year 2000, except George Bush in 2004. Although Republicans have governed for most of this time, because of the Electoral College and because of the way elections are organized at the state level. So I think in a funny way, democratizing our democracy, expanding voting rights would force Republicans to kind of face the music, and I think would have a moderating impact actually on the Republicans. And so I think it's doubly important.
Let me run something on you then, because 2 weeks ago we talked about the Republican Party at a webinar here, and we discussed the fact that Donald Trump has actually attracted new voters for the Republican Party, blue-collar workers and others that would might not have voted for the Republicans previously. So do you think that by making these, regulations, that could actually harm the Republican Party in the long run?
Well, they're at the margins. Republican Party has increased Hispanic male voters and African American voters, but really at the margins. Overwhelming majorities of non-white voters vote for the Democratic Party. 90% of the Republican voting base remains white. And so, in a society as diverse as America's, a party can't survive in this way in a democracy. And so, I think that between the Electoral College and restrictions on voting rights at the state level, this allows the Republican to not feel the same pressure it would if we had a much more majoritarian system. So I think you're right that there's movement in this direction. But there's also a lot of resistance to movement in the kind of more democratizing direction within the Republican Party. And it's essentially, the Republican Party in a way benefits from kind of constitutional protectionism in a way. So it doesn't. So it feels some competitive pressures. So it does, sort of sometimes speak out about reaching out to new voters. But given the fact that it doesn't actually, in the current Senate right now, just to give you another interesting figure, it's 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. Those 50 Democrats represent 40 million more voters than the Republican members of the Senate do. So again, the Republicans are able to hang in there without winning majorities. And so the competitive pressures are much less. And I think if you had these kinds of reforms, the kind of gates would be unleashed. And I think they would ultimately in order to survive, would have to reach out to more diverse voting base.
Another question from the audience. I think I will give this to Jan. Are the parties interested in changing the electoral system? Do you see any signs of that?
There are some signs, I would say, among Democrats that want to change the electoral system. They want to have a system whereby the winner is the one who gets the most votes. And there's also a movement within some states now that says just that if a candidate receives the most votes, he or she should get all the electoral votes. And that, how is it now then? The majority decides. The person that gets the most votes should be the one who becomes president, disregarding the Electoral College. I forgot some niceties there, but there's a movement there, but I'm not sure how long that goes. There are several states who are along this line, and it might become a majority of states, but the Republicans will fight it tooth and nail. I'm not sure. I don't think it'll work.
That was actually a question from the audience, and I will give this one to Daniel. Is there a movement at state level to counter the systematic introduction of voter suppression legislation by the Republicans? So this goes together with what Jan talked about.
Yeah, so all of these all these new efforts to restrict voting rights, and people call this a new Jim Crow. And as anti-democratic as these moves are, I would add this note. I think it's an effective political strategy to call it a new Jim Crow, but I think that may be overstated, because a lot of these efforts at voting restrictions at the state level now are about limiting mail-in voting. And I think what happened is with the last election, there was really this perception that because of COVID, mail-in voting was necessary, and I totally agree with that. And Republicans feel as if somehow this was cheating in some way, or that's the argument of this increased voter turnout, which hurts Republicans. And so there's an effort to kind of pull those reforms back and make mail-in voting more difficult. I kind of think it's a weird fight that Republicans are fighting on this issue, because it's sort of like the general fighting the last war. I mean, and it's not even clear that Democrats benefit disproportionately from mail-in voting. So some of these restrictions, you know, and I think they are anti-democratic. It's not quite fair to call them the new Jim Crow. But nonetheless, I think it's absolutely critical to fight against this. And the most significant efforts to combat this, though, are taking place at the national level, because it's in the states where these voting restrictions are being introduced are in Republican-dominated states. And so Democrats really have no ability to fight against it at the state level. And so that's why the voting legislation that's in front of the Senate now and the Congress now is this bill, HR 1, House Resolution 1, which includes automatic voter registration and other kind of measures like this to make it easier to vote. And so that's where the action has to take place at the national level. One area of interesting reform that Jan kind of is referring to also is that in some states, there's an effort to introduce ranked order voting, so a kind of more proportional voting system. So the state of Maine has this, a couple of other states have introduced this. And so there are these experiments taking place at the state level to really fundamentally change the electoral system to a more proportionate system, like a little bit more like the Swedish system. And, you know, one of the interesting things about American history is that where the innovations have really taken place in the United States is often at the state level. I mean, that's the one virtue of the decentralized system. So women's franchise, you know, expanded earlier at the state level. And so these kinds of reforms that may trickle up eventually to the national level are starting at the state level. But I agree with Jan that, you know, that Republicans will fight very strongly against this. And it's a matter of, you know, can a major kind of social movement develop to push along these kinds of reforms?
All right, something else that I think that we should mention in this webinar about the state of American democracy are two parts of the population that feel that their voices or opinions do not matter. And one of them is the people who have rallied by President Trump. We will come back to those again. And the other one are the people who have gathered in protest for Black Lives Matter. Daniel, does every vote count?
Does every vote count?
Yes.
Well, I think in the sense that our election system was free and fair last time, yes. I mean, I think there's a couple. I mean, our system, of course, has certain flaws in it, including that you have. I mean, you know, a proportion. We don't have a proportionate system. So if you're in a minority, then you're on the losing side, and that's how it goes. You know, 49% of the electorate. Every vote doesn't count in that case. But that's the nature of a majoritarian democracy. And I think, you know, one of the things that President Trump, as we talked about before, and his assault on the truth also was talking about as well, you know, you have this sense that elections aren't free and fair. And I think by all measures they were. And we have this you know, and so I think, you know, we can criticize the system as not as that there are reforms necessary, but I think, you know, we essentially had free and fair elections. So I don't think I think that critique is not quite fair.
What's that?
Yeah, no, I agree with that, definitely. But of course, another question here is every voice heard, which is something else, such as, you know, the voices of those who are subjected to police brutality. And I mean, I'm very sort of worried about the effects of social media on democracy, but there are some good things when it comes to social media and democracy. It does allow people who haven't had a voice in a very obvious way before to spread knowledge about their situation. So when you have these cases of police brutality these days, they're filmed, right? And they're spread on social media, and that very much drives a lot of these protests, of course. It is much, much harder to hide these things now. So I think I mean, this is not unique to US, of course, that you have oppressed groups whose voices are not as easily heard as other voices. And social media can help there, can have a democratizing effect. And I think it has had that when it comes to Black Lives Matter movement.
Can I just add one other thing, which is that one area in which there's grave unfairness in our system is the role of money in our politics. Because, you know, one of the things that has transformed in the last 10 years is the freeing up of the use of money, essentially unregulated money, on political campaigns. And so what this means is that if you're a politician and you can find a billionaire to back you, you can run for offices, you know, and stay in a presidential primary for as long as you want. You can push a particular agenda. And so this does mean that although every vote counts, they don't all count equally. And so that is a problem that prevents certain issues from coming to the fore. And it also means that certain agendas have an outsized voice in our politics. And so, whether that's the gun rights activists, for instance, who are supported by, very well organized gun lobby, or banking interests or whatever, there's a way in which, of course, the playing field is not entirely even in our elections because of our campaign finance system, which is also something that needs reform.
And if we then look at the other part that I mentioned, and Jan, you have talked about this, touched upon this before. How do you view what appears to be a willingness of some groups to use violence to reach political goals? And what does this tendency imply for the future of American democracy? Maybe Jan, would you like to go first?
I think this is very worrying indeed. And I say the Republicans had a chance to condemn what happened on January 6th. And there's a suggestion now that there should be a commission looking at January 6th. And the Republicans are saying, let's look at January 6th, but let's also look at Portland, Oregon, and other places where there has been violence. But these are two very different matters. One of them threatens the core of the system. The other is a social problem that should be dealt with differently. So I don't think the political system will really be able to address the large threat to American democracy that is represented by January 6th, and that really worries me.
Daniel?
Yeah, and I agree with that. And one of the key indicators of a political system in crisis is political violence. Political violence usually precedes democratic breakdowns. I mean, it doesn't always lead to democratic breakdowns, but democratic breakdowns are very often preceded by political violence. And, it wasn't just January 6th. I mean, even before January 6th, there was political murders that took place over the course of the 2020 election year, where people were assaulted and killed in the streets for political reasons. And so, I think there's a couple of different possible responses to that. I mean, one is a rule of law response. And so we have a Justice Department and an FBI, and it needs to obviously address these things in a very serious and sustained way and break up these kinds of networks that are going to use violence in our politics. And that's something that I think, an effective state can do. And I hope that's what's happening now. But there's a second point, which is that mainstream, there's always going to be violence. There's always going to be extremists in a society. I mean, it's to some level, that's a big part of American history. But what's different is, do mainstream politicians view it in their interest to align themselves with those using violence? And what's so totally shocking is that there seems to be a tendency in the current Republican Party in particular to associate oneself with these, or to be a little bit sympathetic, or to at least not be entirely unambiguous. So a lot of Republican politicians will say, oh yeah, what happened on January 6th was bad. These were thugs and so on. But you really push them a bit and they will be ambivalent about it. They'll say, well, some of these people were good patriots, and, and they're being ambivalent about it. And so I think the question is, why is it that mainstream politicians view it in their interest to align themselves? And that's something that I think is very worrying, and that has to be dealt with again at the ballot box, in the sense that there's two responses to this, actually, right? I mean, there's a response that came out of post 1945 Germany, the militant democracy response, where in Germany, if you have extremist parties, you ban them or you limit their ability to access to free speech. In the US, that seems not to really be an option. And so the only option we have is to beat purveyors of violence at the ballot box. And I guess what's worrying is, when you have high levels of polarization, and many, almost half the electorate identifies as Republican, then they're going to vote for these politicians, even if they don't particularly think, they may think what they're saying is distasteful. But if you only have two parties and you don't like the other party, you'll say, well, you'll hold your nose and vote for the Republican Party anyway.
This is coming back to your question also about how democracy deals with these issues. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was extraordinarily shocking that these politicians were willing to condone the violence, or at least not condemn it. Of course, there's been endless discussions about whether this sort of national right-wing populism that Trump supports is fascism or not. But when it comes to the point of using violence for political change, then it becomes fascism, right? So, and there may be a bunch of voters who think that's not such a bad thing. And of course, it is connected to the two-party system and to the antagonism that also inherent in national populism, which is the idea that the other side, they are not just people you disagree with, they are your enemy. They are your enemy, and they are a threat to your life and your country. And that, of course, once you start seeing people you disagree with as enemies, then violence becomes justified. So the antagonism that's connected with not just ideological polarization, but with emotional, affective polarization, is at the end of that lies violence. That's just how it is. And just to be truthful, if you look at numbers, I can't remember if it was Pew Research, whatever it was, but they were looking at also asking Democrats whether they feel okay about using violence to the other side. And that number I can't remember, it was up to 25, 30%. A fair number of people think, yeah. Which of course is a result of a very, very, I mean, this is what Trump did so well. He made the antagonism stronger and stronger and stronger, moving people apart that way. So I think once you've gotten into a situation of very, very strong emotional polarization, violence is around the corner, and how you walk your way back from that, maybe by being incredibly emotionally boring like Biden is key. I think that might be, never go for these wedge issues, these issues that make people scream and kick at each other, stay away from the cultural wars, just try to focus on legislation and making life better for people economically and, with COVID and all that. Maybe that is one way to sort of cool it down and walk your way back from the edge, but it's not an easy process.
How do you then encompass these ideas and political opinions that have received confirmation both of their ideas and of their legitimacy of means? How does one, keeping within the democratic institutions and the democratic norms that you talk about, Daniel, how can you encompass all of these thoughts as well?
Well, so I agree that polarization is a major threat, and that there's the risk of a spiral where when one side breaks the rules, then it's very tempting for the other side to break the rules. It's a little bit like going into a boxing match with one hand tied behind your back, and the person with the hand tied behind their back says, "Well, this is ridiculous. I'm going to fight with both hands too." And so there is that risk, and I think we do see some signs of this. I mean, I would say. That the flip side of the story, though, is that and you see that it's hard to break out of that spiral, I should say. But the flip side of this, and one thing that does give me, days when I wake up more optimistic. I mean, it's not every day that I wake up more optimistic. It's a sunny day here in Boston, so maybe I'll tell you the optimistic argument, which is that majority Americans are much more liberal and progressive in their own attitudes about the world than many people think, than our politics would suggest. I mean, there's the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, there was opinion surveys that came out that majorities of whites think that African Americans aren't treated equally, and majorities of whites are willing to say this in a way that they were not willing to say in 1972 or 1968, the last time there were these kinds of disruptions. So Americans have become much more progressive on racial questions and lots of other questions. The problem is that our political system doesn't represent those majorities. I mean, I think again, as I said before, Republicans have only won the presidency, the popular vote for the presidency once in 2004. And this was after the September 11th attacks. It was an incumbent. It was a kind of an exceptional situation. In fact, Republicans have only won the last time the Republican before, except for 2004, the last time the Republicans have won the popular vote in the presidency was in 1988. I mean, think about that. I mean, this is incredible, right? So, the majorities of Americans are not on this kind of nationalist side. And so the question is, how do we get our political system to represent these views? And I think the current system, because of these things that we've already talked about, the Electoral College, the overrepresentation of, I mean, the problem with the Electoral College is that it's made up, the number of electors of each state, or one of the problems with it is the number of electors of each state is constituted by the number of senators from each state, as well as the number of congressmen of each state. Now, the number of senators of each state is 2 senators per state, whether you're Delaware and Wyoming with 500,000 citizens, or California with 30 million citizens. Okay, so this means that small states are overrepresented. That's always been the case. That's by design. That's the nature of our system, because in order to form this federation. But what's changed, though, is that throughout American history, until the last 20, 30 years, you had an urban and rural wing to both political parties. And so there was not this systematic rural overrepresentation didn't have a partisan consequence. I mean, both parties benefited from this. But because of economic changes and just economic geography, today, more than at any point in the last 100 years, the correlation between population density and party voting is stronger now than it's ever been. And so in other words, the Democrats are the party of urban and suburban areas. The Republican Party is the party of rural areas. And because rural areas are overrepresented, not by Republican design, but nonetheless, Republicans benefit from this and are overrepresented in the Electoral College, in the Senate. And so these voices have much greater weight than they actually do in the electorate. And so, what do we do? Do we reform our system? And that's the position that I have. Others say, well, Democrats should learn how to compete in rural areas. And that may be true as well. But what's clear is that actually majorities of Americans don't subscribe to a lot of this violence. But the other sad part of the story, though, is that it doesn't require majorities to kill a democracy, right? So even if a majority doesn't support this stuff, that's we shouldn't rest too easy because of that.
So then, I mean, one way of looking at the political development and also the inability to come to terms with the violence, and how violence has been used for political means, feels like American democracy is dependent on the Republican Party in some way. But you said you were optimistic today, so maybe Åsa or Jan, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that as Daniel has said, that the developments within the Republican Party are very much a large part of the problems of the U.S. democracy. And again, the fact that they don't condemn violence, the fact that they go with lies, like with the non-certification of the presidential election results, and the fact of the polarization that Åsa mentioned so much. I mean, these three things are very worrying, I think, and to the extent that there is not a sane wing of the Republican Party that can take over from Donald Trump. I'm worried, and there are a couple of younger Trumpers as well that are equally worrying, if not more so. And there's at the same time there is a small wing of sane people, but we'll see with the primaries and so on whether some of those people can make progress and take out these people who go for violence, who accept violence, who lie constantly, and who don't accept the results of the presidential election. There are hopes, but I'm mostly negative about the development of the Republican Party at the present time.
Åsa, how do you meet claims of election fraud when facts are not a viable argument?
Well, I mean, in a democracy, the idea is that you meet claims with reason, right? So you come with evidence, and when people are uncertain, you recount the votes. And when there's still uncertainty, you take it to the courts and you provide evidence, and you do all the stuff that was being done. Now, if at the end of the day, people still don't believe, there isn't that much left to do. And this is the scary part, right? I mean, we have to use reason when we disagree, and we have to use reason when claims are disputed. But when reason doesn't help in the end, what do you do? I mean, the fact, what we don't really know, I think we don't really know, is how many of these 75% of the Republican voters who claim that the election was stolen, whether they actually believe it. We don't really know. So the hope is that it's more sort of cheerleading that's going on than actual expression of belief. And if it is that, then maybe things will just settle a bit. Maybe things are there are lots of problems in the US, right? If Biden now can handle some of these problems and make lives better for people, then maybe things can just settle down, and people who sort of do know that Trump lost, but and are accepting that Biden, after all, is the president, and after all, is addressing some of these issues. Maybe, like I said before, maybe things can just cool down that way. But it depends a lot, again, on what major Republican politicians do, and it depends on whether Trump pops up again. So I think it's very, very hard to predict. One development that could happen that I think would be great if the Republican Party broke in two, of course. You get 3 parties suddenly, or maybe even 4. That would be I think a vitalization of American democracy that would be extremely good. I don't know, Daniel, if you think that can happen or not, but
yeah, I mean, I've thought about that, and there's been some discussion of it, but it seems pretty, and I think especially after January 6th, there was some thought that this might happen, that there would be kind of and actually even Trump himself said he might start a new party, and so on. But it's become pretty clear now that the Republican leadership in the Congress, they've gone down to Mar-a-Lago and they kiss the ring and hang out at his resort, and I mean, they seem to be fully enthralled with Trump, in part. I mean, there's this kind of great irony that there are all these guys who want to run for president in 2024, and they're like trapped in this way because they have, in order to win over the Trump voters, they have to sing Trump's praises. But they're all Trump's rivals. They don't want Trump to run in 2024. All of these ambitious young senators would love to be the candidate for president, but in order to become Trump's successor, they have to praise Trump. And in the process, they continue to build up Trump. And so they're in this kind of very strange situation. So I guess my short answer is, at the current moment, I don't see this break happening. Although I agree it would be a good development. But I mean, just one thing I should say is that 70 million or so voters voted for Trump. But another way to think about this, and this is again on a sunny day, that less than 50% of Republicans identify, or less than 50% of the electorate identifies as Republican. Even certainly less than 50%, and about 50% of those people think that are sort of I mean, it's hard to know how you assess who a dyed-in-the-wool Trump voter is, but there's some questions like, do you want Trump to run again in 2024? Would you support the Republican Party without Trump? And and also these questions about how much, what do you think about these January 6th assaults and so on? And I would say roughly it seems to be about 50% of Republicans support this. And so that's a huge number, but it is still only, we're talking now like 20% of the electorate. So that means 80% of the electorate disagrees with this stuff. And so, to what degree is, having 20% of the electorate essentially embracing an authoritarian, to what degree is this a novel development in American history? And I guess one point I would make is that actually it's not that novel. I mean, you think of, the supporters of George Wallace in the 1960s as segregationists. You think of the supporters of Joe McCarthy in the 1950s. You think of the supporters of Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana, who was a bit of an authoritarian as well. Henry Ford wanted to run for president and was singing Adolf Hitler's praises and cited by Adolf Hitler in the 1920s. Large segments of the American electorate liked him. So I think comparing it to West European democracies as well, around 20% of the electorate tends to vote for these kinds of parties. And so, what's distinctive about the US is that this segment of the electorate, because of our institutions, has captured one of the two parties. And so that's what's totally frightening, because the idea that this party could be back in power in 4 years, all branches of government, is I find frightening. And yet it's only 20% of the electorate at its hardcore.
Right. I mean, that 20, like you're saying, 20%, that is how it tends to go in all countries in Western Europe too, around that will be interested in an authoritarian populist leader. But when you have a many-party system, of course, there's more room for maneuvering than you guys have. Yeah.
So, Jan, looking at the history that Daniel just described, does that give you some sort of hope that, democracy prevailed? And
I think what's very important is what Åsa just said, that Joe Biden is successful and that the Democrats can consolidate their power for several years so that there is an opening for more sane Republicans. Because if Biden fails and if the Republicans take over Congress in 22, I will sleep very badly. And if they win the presidency also in 24, I won't sleep at all. So I think the coming few years are very important, and the success, just as Åsa said, of the Biden administration, I think is very important to consolidate democracy in the United States. I'm afraid I don't think that the Voting Rights Act, the HR 1 will pass, because it's going to be very difficult to get the Republicans to. I agree that would be good, very good reform, but it's going to be very difficult.
this brings us in some way to a discussion about where the level of responsibility lies, because Daniel, in your book, How Democracies Die, I perceive reliance on institutions such as parties or political norms to ensure democracy. Whereas, Åsa, in your book about alternative facts, I see the emphasis rather on the individual. Would you agree with this? And are there lessons or points from the respective, ways of looking at it?
Well, I think, no, I mean, in my book, Alternative Facts, of course, my focus is on the threat to knowledge. And the individual will play a role there because of the role of critical thinking. So it's quite natural that there's quite a bit on the individual. But another focus in my book is the role of institutions for knowledge, right? Because the very central claim is that knowledge is social in its character. It's something we create together. Most things we don't know because we experience them, but we know them from various sources and so on, from other people. So we depend on other people and a well-functioning sort of epistemic institutions for knowledge to thrive and for democracy to thrive. So institutions are very central there, like an independent media and of course universities and so on. So it's a very similar idea that, of course, yes, the individual matters. That matters also in a democracy because the individual will vote, right? Individual matters when it comes to critical thinking, but none of this works unless the institutions around the individual function. So it's a very parallel thing, actually.
Daniel, would you like to comment?
Yeah, well, there's this interesting phenomena that I mean, I agree with this, that I mean, as a long-term solution. Clearly, I mean, at some level, I say, 20% of the American electorate embraces authoritarians, and that's sort of accepting that as a given, maybe is really kind of an unacceptable position, because of course, over the long run, the goal of education, the goal of at all levels, university, elementary level, is to transform a citizenry to make it, to make a citizenry more democratic. So I think that's a long-term goal. But in a kind of a moment of acute crisis, I guess the point is, how do you keep, what are the institutions that you can use to keep somebody who's going to be a threat to your life and your democracy out of power? And that's the kind of, so in some sense, the disagreement would be about a kind of short run solution versus a long run solution. And I think over the long run, certainly we need to address this. I mean, it's, to have, people embracing authoritarian is no way to, it keeps putting us in this dangerous position. So I think that we need to address this a bit. But one interesting fact that I just was recently looking at is that, you sort of think Americans maybe don't trust their institutions or trust their politicians. And, that there's this phenomenon where you ask Americans, there's a survey that was done, it's done every year, that asks people, do you have trust in Congress? And I think 20% of voters say they have trust in Congress. So this sounds terribly frightening. And you sort of think, how can you have a democracy like this? But then you ask people, do you trust your congressmen? And 60% of people say yes, right? So in other words, there's this kind of abstract distrust. But this is a paradox, of course, because if you don't trust, who is it that doesn't like Congress if everybody likes their congressperson? They just don't like other people's congressperson. So, again, it's hard to read a kind of crisis of our institutions off of that, because that gap between abstract distrust and higher levels of trust for your own individual congressperson is something that goes back to the 1970s. And so I think the blame, I sort of have a hard time, again, blaming most Americans for our troubles. I mean, I think, again, it's really that we have this inability to translate what most citizens want to the kind of public policy realm. And, I hope that our institutions can adapt to this. And I think as Jan is, I'm not entirely optimistic about the ability of this law to pass. And one thing that I think is underappreciated is that the reason why we're having to pass this voting rights law is that we had a previous voting rights law that was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. 2013. And so it's not even clear that the current bill would pass muster with the current court. So this is another veto player that blocks, another institution that kind of blocks sensible reform, I think.
Exactly. I was going to say, we haven't even talked about that.
Yes.
And how the Supreme Court indeed does not reflect the majority of Americans' views on a lot of issues. That's another anti-democratic kind of component in the US.
Yeah, and there's this funny part of that, which is that, you have, because federal court appointees are appointed for life, and people live longer, and especially the Supreme Court has become a very prestigious position. People hold on to these positions, until they die, basically. And this wasn't always the case. And so, because even though, you'd asked at the beginning, what is President Trump's kind of impact on American democracy? One way in which he will have a major impact for the next 30 years is his appointment of the federal judiciary. And so it's sort of long after Trump is gone, reaching from the grave, he'll continue to affect American politics because all the judges he appointed will be in power.
Another institution that we have only, touched upon, which is also a crucial democratic institution, is media. And we have quite a few questions from the audience, and I will read you one of those. What can be done about the polarizing media climate of politically aligned news outlets? Who would like to go for that question? Rosa?
Well, it all started, what was it, in the 80s when Reagan changed the law about how news had to be balanced, right?
Right.
And
the fairness doctrine.
Fairness doctrine, and basically opened the gates to incredibly partisan political news reporting. I mean, this was long before social media, right? And we had Rush Limbaugh who immediately sprang into action and created this whole media universe of extreme partisan media. And then, of course, we have Fox News, and now we have even more extreme TV channels like that. So what to do about that in America, I have no idea at this point, because I think that, legislation, I guess, in order to dial that back. I don't know. What do you think, Daniel?
Yeah, no, I agree that's. I mean, the good news is that there was an institutional reform that created this. So that also suggests there's institutional reforms that could undo it. But I agree that this is a major problem, and that our media, I always like to make the distinction between journalism and the media. Journalism is a profession where people are guided by a certain professional code of the pursuit of truth and facts and so on. Whereas media is a business, is often, these are media companies that are driven by bottom line, and that, are driven by, algorithms to increase the frequency of people hitting the headline and so on. And so, I think the problem is that in a lot of ways that as much as a free market helps promote range of views, it also leads potentially to this kind of polarized setting. When your politics is polarized, then the media will grow to reflect that. And one thing that I think could play a bigger role in American political life, but this is again one of these fantasy kind of proposals, is the role of public media. Because my sense is that the larger the public media sector within a country, the bigger the player they are. This shapes the media landscape. And so whether you have public television stations in Germany, or I imagine in Sweden as well, yes, that even if you have a free marketplace, that this shapes how other actors respond to it, and it provides a kind of center of gravity. Yeah,
exactly. So there's quite a bit of research that shows that democracies work better in countries where public service is strong.
Right. Yeah. So that's something that, and I think, like, for instance, public radio in the United States actually plays even a bigger role than public television. I mean, it's quite, people really listen to public radio, and there's local public radio stations. And so that actually has I would say, a net positive impact. But in general, this polarization is certain in the media landscape is terrible. And one of the things that it does is that when the media is itself viewed as part of the political opposition, then you're in a bad position, and so, when President Trump would go after the media as kind of the fake news and so on, again, that and the media viewed itself in this way. I mean, I think it's, if you watch, anti-Trump media today, MSNBC, I mean, it's just, even if you don't like Trump, it's kind of nauseating that all they do is, for an hour a day, talk about President Trump and what he's up to and what he's doing, and, you're not hearing about any news about the rest of the world. And so this has this negative effect kind of on all sides, I would say.
So we are sort of running out of time, unfortunately, but I wanted to give you a last chance to comment on something that, a takeaway from this discussion, or maybe something that we should have discussed and will let the audience think about afterwards. Jan, do you have any?
Yes, I have one very important question that we haven't talked about. In the 2040s, the United States will be a country where whites will not be the majority. It will be minority majority country. And how do these people who are whites and support Trump and the Republican Party handle this problem? Daniel just mentioned that 90% of the voters of the Republicans are whites. That's not an accident. So here I see a very big problem.
Åsa, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is an important one to mention, and this, of course, is why even the Republican Party has been talking about reforming. But then along came Trump and showed that they could still win elections without getting these groups. That will have to change. So I think long term, there's hope. You just have to sort of survive on the way.
Daniel, do you want to give us any
Yeah,
final thoughts?
I agree with that. I mean, there's some, people who think that, the U.S. has the opportunity to be, the world's first really truly multiracial democracy. And, again, in my more optimistic moments, I think that's actually possible, that there is a possibility that we could reach that. But, I think in the meantime, there's a lot of damage that can be done. And in the meantime, this transition, which as far as I know, no democracy has really undergone, is having these incredibly destructive consequences. And, the question is, how do we get from here to there? And I think that stands, I agree with Jan, as the major central challenge that underpins a lot of everything that we've been talking about.
And these will be our concluding thoughts. Thank you so much, Daniel, Jan, and Åsa, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. Thank you, all the audience, for watching and for all of your questions. Thank you, Hedvig and Stina and Julia, for steering the technology, and welcome back to the Institute again. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.